asset relief program may go down as the thing that stopped the Great Recession from becoming a depression, but the cop in charge of it says that Washington abandoned you in order to save the banks. He'll make his case next. So if you're still watching me, then there's some chance that you believe we could get hit by another massive economic storm. A lot of people think the last recession wasn't worse than it was because the government stepped in with TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Now, in a controversial new book, the man who served as the official watchdog for the Treasury Department's economic crisis response says that the $700 billion TARP program may have actually caused more problems than it solved. I'm going to talk to him in a minute, but first I want to remind you about what we are talking about here. TARP gave the banks money, encouraged them to lend it out to keep Americans in their homes, running their businesses, going to college, and buying cars. Here's a scene from Too Big to Fail, the movie that portrayed an exchange between Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke and then Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson.
I hope they use the money the way we're asking them to. They will. Lend it out, won't they? Of course they will.
4 years after the crash, credit is still tight. Americans who want to become homeowners still have trouble getting mortgages. But taxpayers, that's you, still own part of the companies that got bailed out. You own 1/3 of General Motors, 61% of AIG, and nearly 3/4 of Ally Financial. And you continue to pay for the bailout. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that TARP will end up costing $32 billion. The Treasury's estimate is even higher, $70 billion. Well, Neil Barofsky was the special investigator general assigned to monitor TARP. He's now joined the ranks of its critics with a new book called Bailout, an inside account of how Washington abandoned Main Street while rescuing Wall Street. Neil, welcome to the show. The problem back then, very clearly, like the name of the movie that I just showed that clip from, was too big to fail. 4 years ago, the assets of the 5 largest U.S. banks were $6 trillion. Now they're $8.5 trillion. The banks are bigger than they were then. If they were too big to fail then, they're much bigger now.
Exactly, and this was the policy response of our government. You know, a government which, as I detail in the book, is really puts the interest and defers the interests of the largest financial institutions over that of the taxpayer. And they've grown these banks bigger with the government support. And as we know, TARP was supposed to do a lot more than just shovel money into the capital holes of the banks. It was supposed to protect the system, increase lending, and help the economy. And as we know, the only real policy ties to that goal was what you saw in that clip,
right?
A hope. But they didn't do the nice necessary.
Could it have been done, because we may get into the situation again, I hope not, could it have been done in some fashion that had more than a hope attached to it, that we're going to give you access to all of this capital in the midst of a credit freeze when no one could borrow money from anyone, but you've actually got to do something with this in terms of lending it out to people?
Absolutely. This money was given with no strings attached. And when I went down and started making recommendations, not just about these things, but also about anti-fraud provisions, conflicts of interest that were cooked in, I was met with such steely resistance.
Yep.
So, for example, an incentive to actually lend the money, a requirement to lend the money out into the economy. And the answers I would get, no matter what my subject was always the same. And it really crossed administrations. I was told, oh, no, we don't need to do that. We don't need to have conditions. We don't need to have transparency.
Why were they so deferential? Why were the administrations so deferential to the banks? Because we like to see in political commercials that we're not, that they're the 1%, they're the problem. But why? You were inside and you say that Treasury was highly deferential to the banks.
Exactly. And the response was, well, we don't have to worry because the banks, they would never embarrass themselves. They would never risk their reputations. And part of the problem is the big revolving door between Washington and Wall Street. And it's not a Democrat problem or a Republican problem, but so many of these individuals come from the very same banks.
How would breaking them up make any difference? You'd go from 20 big banks to 50 or 80 smaller but still influential banks, all of whom have the same interests. So they would lobby the same way. They'd take the same position on things. These banks don't tend to differ from each other on what they want the government to do.
The difference is if you have what we have now are these banks that are too big to fail. And that means that if anything happens to one of them, they lose so much money, they get in trouble with the law. If they go down, they bring the whole system down.
Right.
And that
credit freezes up, people lose jobs, the economy suffers.
Right, distorts all the incentives. So as a result, they could take more risks than they normally would because of that implicit guarantee. And equally important, as we see the parade of financial scandals every day,
unbelievable.
They can't be charged. They can't be held criminally accountable because if the United States government was to indict one of these banks, boom, economy over.
Sandy Weil, let me just play, you've heard it already. He's a former CEO of Citigroup, probably a poster child for too big to fail. agrees with you. He said he wants to break the banks up a little bit. Listen to what he had to say.
So I think what we should probably do is go and split up investment banking from banking, have banks do something that's not going to risk the taxpayer dollars, that's not going to be too big to fail.
So he's talking about the Volcker rule. Very weird. We've been trying to get more comment from him. Strangely, he has said he is making no further comment than that interview he did. What's up with that? What do you make of that sea change?
I think there's just this growing recognition that we have to break up the banks in order to have a better economy. It'd be better off for shareholders, better off for investors, and better off for all of America.
Does anybody suffer if we break up the banks? I mean, do bankers still not make lots of money?
You know who suffers?
Do shareholders not make lots of money?
Under this current model, the too big to bank and their executives make more money because they get what's essentially a subsidy from the assumption that they'll be guaranteed. They get this immunity from prosecution to a certain extent because of these fears. You take that away, they individually will suffer. But it's very interesting, if you've seen this happen in the last year, as more and more economists, regulators, special inspectors general come on this side. Who's really left defending the status quo? The big banks and their enablers in Washington. The United States Treasury Department that fought against bipartisan effort to break up the banks back in 2010. They're among the very few people that are still on the sides of keeping what is a very, very broken status quo.
And you write in the book, I now realize the American people should lose faith in their government. It's an excellent read. Neil Barofsky is a former Special Inspector General of TARP, a senior fellow at NYU Law School, and he's the author of Bailout, an inside account of how Washington abandoned Main Street while rescuing Wall Street. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
The storm may be